At 8:47 on a quiet Thursday morning, Daniel walked out of the building where he had spent the last 22 years of his life. In his hands was a small cardboard box. Inside were the ordinary pieces of a career that had once felt permanent. A coffee mug, a framed photo of his family, a few notebooks, and a company badge that no longer worked. Behind him, the office building looked exactly the same as it had every other morning. Employees were arriving, phones were ringing, meetings were starting. Inside, it was just another normal day. But Daniel was no longer part of it. Less than 10 minutes earlier, he'd been sitting in a small conference room. Across the table sat his manager. Next to him was someone from HR. The conversation was calm, professional, short, and when it ended, Daniel's job no longer existed. 22 years of loyalty ended in a meeting that lasted less than 10 minutes. But here's the strange part. That moment didn't begin that morning. It began years earlier. And Daniel didn't realize it until everything was already over. Daniel was 47. For 22 years, he had worked at the same logistics company. 22 years waking up early, driving the same route through familiar streets, parking in the same corner of the office lot, walking through the same glass doors every morning. At some point, the routine stopped feeling temporary. It started feeling permanent. Inside the office, Daniel knew everything. He knew the suppliers. He knew the shipping schedules. He knew which problems usually appeared on Mondays and which delays always happened before the holidays. When something went wrong, people often came to him. Not because he had a fancy title, but because he had experience. And experience creates a quiet kind of confidence. The kind that grows slowly over time. Year after year, Daniel watched employees come and go. Some stayed a few months, some stayed a few years. But Daniel remained. He had survived management changes, new company policies, even economic downturns. And every time something changed, Daniel was still sitting at the same desk. At home, life felt just as stable. Daniel and his wife had bought their house more than 10 years earlier. The mortgage payment still arrived every month. But it had become predictable. Just another bill in the family budget. Their son was finishing high school. College applications were already being discussed at the dinner table. Tuition would be expensive. But Daniel believed they would manage. After all, he had something many people didn't. A stable job, a stable income, a stable life. From the outside, Daniel looked like a man who had figured things out. And over time, he began believing something that many people believe after enough years in the same place. That loyalty creates security. That experience guarantees relevance. That the company will always need someone who has been there this long. But stability has a strange psychological effect. The longer it lasts, the more permanent it begins to feel. And when something feels permanent, people stop preparing for change. If you've ever stayed in the same job for many years because it felt safe, write the number 1 in the comments. Many people realize too late that comfort and security are not the same thing. Stability feels like protection, but sometimes it quietly becomes the reason people stop growing. The changes didn't begin with a crisis. They began quietly, almost too quietly to notice. By the time Daniel reached his early 40s, his job had become something he could do almost automatically. He knew the patterns of the business. He knew how shipments moved through the system. He knew which suppliers were reliable and which ones always caused delays. Experience had made the job easier. And when work becomes easier, something interesting often happens. People stop pushing themselves as hard as they once did. At first, Daniel didn't notice the shift. But slowly, the effort he used to put into learning new things began to fade. When the company introduced a new logistics software platform, Daniel didn't feel much urgency to master it. He had already been doing the job for nearly 2 decades. The old system had worked fine. And besides, there were younger employees in the department who seemed to understand the new technology immediately. "Can you handle that part?" Daniel would sometimes say. And usually they did. Optional training sessions were offered from time to time. Daniel rarely attended. He told himself he was busy dealing with real operational problems. After all, he had experience. And experience had solved problems long before any new software appeared. But over time, something subtle began to happen. The tasks that required technical knowledge slowly moved toward the younger employees. They navigated the new systems faster. They understood the data dashboards. They talked about analytics, automation, and optimization, words that hadn't been part of Daniel's daily work before. Meanwhile, Daniel focused on coordination, schedules, communication between teams, the parts of the job that still felt familiar. And in his mind, that division made perfect sense. Experience still mattered. At least, that's what he believed. But beneath that belief, another thought had quietly started forming. A thought many people begin to carry after 40. I'm too old to start over. Learning new systems felt frustrating. Keeping up with rapidly changing technology felt exhausting. And Daniel had already built a life around the stability he had. A house, a family, a routine that worked. Starting from zero again wasn't something he even wanted to imagine. So he stayed where he felt most comfortable, doing what he already knew, trusting that experience alone would continue to protect him. And for a long time, it seemed like it did. Until the world around him began changing faster than he realized. Experience is valuable, but experience only proves what worked yesterday. It does not guarantee relevance tomorrow. The changes didn't arrive all at once. They arrived in small, almost invisible steps. At first, the company introduced new automation tools. Management described them as efficiency upgrades, better tracking, faster reporting, smarter logistics systems. On the surface, it sounded like a normal improvement. Companies upgrade their systems all the time. At first, Daniel didn't think much about it. But slowly, he began noticing something subtle. Processes that once required several employees were now being handled automatically by software. Tasks that used to involve phone calls and coordination could now be completed in seconds through a dashboard. For the younger employees in the department, the new systems felt natural. Many of them had grown up using digital tools. They adapted quickly. Within a few weeks, they were navigating the new platform faster than anyone else. In meetings, their conversations sounded different. They talked about automation strategies, data analytics, process optimization, concepts that had never been part of Daniel's job before. At first, Daniel assumed this was just another phase of modernization. He had seen changes before, new managers, new policies, new software. Each time the company adjusted, things eventually stabilized, and Daniel was still there. So when the new system felt confusing, he postponed learning it deeply. When younger employees handled technical details more easily, he allowed them to take the lead. After all, Daniel still had something they didn't: experience. But over time, the pattern became harder to ignore. New internal projects started appearing across the department. Projects focused on automation, system upgrades, data-driven logistics planning, the kind of projects that would shape the company's future. Naturally, Daniel assumed he would be involved. After all, he had spent more than 2 decades in the company. But when the project teams were announced, Daniel noticed something unexpected. His name wasn't on the list. Instead, the teams were filled with younger employees, people who had joined the company only a few years earlier, people who understood the new systems better. At first, Daniel didn't react. He told himself it didn't matter. He still had his position. He still handled daily operations. But slowly, something uncomfortable began to grow. His role in the department was becoming smaller, not suddenly, but gradually. Tasks that once depended on him were now handled by software. Responsibilities he once managed were given to employees who understood the new systems better. And Daniel remained exactly where he had always been, doing the same work, in the same office, at the same desk. The future of the company was being built, just not around him. At first, the changes were easy to ignore. Daniel still came to the office every morning. He still handled shipments. He still coordinated schedules. On the surface, his job looked exactly the same. But something underneath had begun to shift. The department felt different. Meetings felt different. The conversations around the office had changed. More and more discussions revolved around automation systems, data analysis, digital tracking, optimization models, topics that had rarely appeared in the past. Younger employees spoke about these systems with confidence. They moved quickly through dashboards and reports. They explained new tools that Daniel barely understood. At first, Daniel told himself it wasn't important. Every company goes through phases of change. This was probably just another one. That was the first stage. Denial. Then came irritation. Sometimes, during meetings, Daniel found himself feeling quietly annoyed. The younger employees seemed overly excited about technology. They talked about replacing manual processes with automated systems. They described improvements that sounded impressive on paper. But to Daniel, many of the old methods had worked perfectly well. Why fix something that wasn't broken? Why complicate processes that had worked for decades? The frustration wasn't loud. Daniel didn't argue in meetings. He simply listened in silence. But inside, the irritation slowly grew. Then came the most dangerous stage: avoidance. Instead of confronting the changes, Daniel focused on what he already knew. The familiar tasks, the routines he had mastered years earlier. He let younger employees take responsibility for the technical systems. He avoided projects that required learning the new software deeply. And the more he avoided those changes, the easier it became to keep avoiding them. Day after day, week after week, Daniel continued doing what he had always done. And because the office still looked the same, because his job title hadn't changed, because his paycheck still arrived every month, it became easy to believe that everything was still fine. But deep down, something else was happening. The department was moving forward. Technology was reshaping the way the company operated. New systems were becoming the foundation of the future. And Daniel was slowly becoming less connected to that future. Not because he lacked intelligence, not because he lacked experience, but because adapting had started to feel harder than staying the same. The most dangerous career risk is not making a mistake. It is slowly becoming irrelevant while believing everything is still fine. One Monday morning, an email appeared in Daniel's inbox. Subject line: Company Update. Organizational restructuring. At first, it didn't seem unusual. Large companies send emails like this all the time. Announcements, policy changes, new management initiatives. Most of them rarely change daily work in any dramatic way. Daniel had seen similar emails before. So he opened it, skimmed through the message, and returned to his tasks. The email talked about efficiency, process improvements, technology integration, future growth, corporate language that sounded professional and carefully neutral. Nothing in the message directly suggested danger. But a few days later, the department was called into a conference room. Management stood at the front. Slides appeared on the screen. The presentation began. Words like automation and optimization appeared repeatedly. Charts showed how technology could streamline operations. Processes that once required several employees could now be completed faster by automated systems. Management described the transformation as progress. The company was entering a new phase, a more efficient phase, a more technologically advanced phase. And as the presentation continued, something subtle began to form in the room. A quiet tension. Some employees leaned forward with interest. Others simply watched in silence. Daniel listened carefully. Part of him felt a small wave of unease. Automation, system integration, operational efficiency. These words sounded harmless in a presentation, but they rarely appear without consequences. Still, Daniel reassured himself. He had been with the company for more than 2 decades. He understood the logistics network. He knew the suppliers. He knew the operational details better than most people in the department. Surely someone with that level of experience would always have a place. So when the meeting ended, Daniel returned to his desk. And like many people who have lived inside stability for a long time, he repeated the same quiet belief. Things will settle down again. They always do. After all, he had survived many changes before. New managers, new policies, new systems, and every time the company evolved, Daniel was still there, which made it easy to believe that this time would be no different. When stability lasts long enough, people stop imagining the possibility of real change. And that belief can feel completely reasonable, right up until the moment it stops being true. A few days after the restructuring presentation, Daniel received another message. It appeared quietly on his calendar. 10:30 a.m. Quick meeting. No additional details. Meetings like this were common in the office. Managers scheduled short discussions all the time. Project updates, operational reviews, routine conversations. So when the reminder appeared on his screen that morning, Daniel didn't think much about it. At 10:28, he stood up from his desk and walked toward the conference room. The hallway looked exactly the same as always. Employees were typing at their computers. Phones were ringing. Someone laughed at a joke near the break room. Just another normal morning. But when Daniel opened the conference room door, something immediately felt different. His manager was already sitting at the table, and beside him sat someone from Human Resources. The room was quiet, professional, almost too calm. Daniel took a seat. For a few seconds, no one spoke. Then the manager began explaining. The company was continuing the restructuring process that had been announced earlier. Automation systems were expanding across the department. Operational roles were being reviewed. The explanation sounded careful, measured, every word chosen to remain respectful. Daniel listened silently. Part of him already understood where the conversation was heading. Then the sentence finally arrived. His position would be eliminated as part of the restructuring plan. The company appreciated his years of dedication. They recognized his contribution. But the role itself would no longer exist in the new structure. The manager's voice remained calm. There was no anger, no conflict, just a decision that had already been made. The HR representative slid a folder across the table. Inside was a severance package, compensation, transition assistance, formal documents. Everything handled professionally, respectfully. The conversation lasted less than 15 minutes. Daniel nodded. He thanked them for the opportunity. Then he stood up. 22 years after walking into that building for the first time, Daniel walked out of the conference room for the last time. Outside the room, the office continued exactly as it had before. Emails were still being sent. Meetings were still happening. Phones were still ringing. But Daniel's career there had already ended. 22 years of loyalty ended in a meeting that lasted less than 10 minutes. The next morning, Daniel woke up at the same time as always, 6:30 a.m. For more than 20 years, his body had followed the same routine. Alarm clock, coffee in the kitchen, a quick drive to the office. But this morning felt different. There was nowhere he needed to go. No office waiting, no shipments to coordinate, no problems to solve before lunch. For the first time in decades, the structure of Daniel's day had disappeared. At first, the silence felt strange, almost unreal. He still moved through the house out of habit. He made coffee. He looked at the clock. For a moment, it felt like he was simply running late, like he should already be on the road. But then the reality returned. There was no job waiting for him anymore. Daniel sat at the kitchen table and stared at the coffee in his hands. The house was quiet. Too quiet. For years, his work had filled most of his day. Emails, phone calls, schedules, unexpected problems that required quick decisions. Work had provided structure. It had given his days direction. Now that structure was gone. And when structure disappears, something deeper often appears. Questions. At first, Daniel tried not to think about them. But the thoughts kept returning. He began reviewing his career in his mind. 22 years managing logistics operations, coordinating suppliers, solving delays, keeping systems running smoothly. But outside that environment, another uncomfortable thought began forming. What do I actually know how to do now? The industry had changed. Technology had changed. Even the tools used in his job had evolved. The skills that once made him valuable suddenly felt uncertain. For many men, work is more than income. Over time, it quietly becomes part of identity. It defines routine. It defines purpose. It defines how someone sees themselves. And when that role disappears, the problem is not only financial, it becomes personal, very personal. Daniel wasn't just searching for another job. He was searching for a new sense of direction. Losing a job is rarely just about money. Sometimes it feels like losing the version of yourself you thought would last forever. At first, Daniel tried not to think about money. The severance package gave him a little breathing room, a few months to figure things out. On paper, the numbers looked manageable, but real life rarely stays on paper. A week later, Daniel sat at the kitchen table reviewing his expenses. That's when reality began to feel clearer. The mortgage payment was still there. Every month, the same amount. The same automatic withdrawal from his bank account. That part of life hadn't changed just because his job had. Then there was something else. His son's college plans. Applications had already been submitted. Acceptance letters would arrive soon. For years, Daniel had assumed that his steady income would support those tuition payments. Now the timeline suddenly looked different. Savings existed, but not enough to feel comfortable for long. They had always been meant as a safety net, not a long-term solution. And savings have a quiet habit. They disappear faster than people expect when income stops. Daniel wasn't reckless with money. He had done what most middle-class families try to do: work steadily, pay the bills, save when possible, build stability over time. But stability has a weakness. It depends on the continuation of the same conditions that created it. When those conditions change, the numbers begin telling a different story. The mortgage doesn't pause. College tuition doesn't disappear. Groceries still need to be bought. Insurance payments still arrive. Life continues exactly as it did before. The only thing that changes is the income that once supported it all. Sitting at the kitchen table, Daniel looked again at the spreadsheet in front of him. For the first time in many years, the future felt uncertain. Not because he had been irresponsible, not because he had made terrible decisions, but because something he once believed was permanent had quietly disappeared. Financial stability often feels strong, until the moment the income behind it suddenly stops. Looking back, Daniel eventually realized something uncomfortable. The collapse of his career didn't begin in that conference room. It had begun years earlier, not with a dramatic mistake, not with a sudden crisis, but with something much quieter. Comfort. For a long time, Daniel believed comfort meant security, a stable job, a predictable routine, a life that moved forward in a straight line. But comfort and security are not the same thing. Comfort simply means things feel familiar. Security means you are prepared when things change. And Daniel slowly began to understand the difference. For years, he believed his experience would protect him. 22 years in the same company, 22 years solving problems and keeping operations running. But experience has a limitation. It proves what you were capable of yesterday. It does not automatically guarantee relevance tomorrow. The company didn't suddenly become cruel. Technology didn't appear overnight. The truth was much simpler. Change had been happening the entire time. Slowly, quietly, almost invisibly. A new system here, a new hire there. A process updated, a responsibility shifted. Individually, none of these things looked dangerous. But together, they reshaped everything. And that is how most real change happens. Not through explosions, but through small adjustments that accumulate over time. Daniel's story isn't unusual. Many people miss the warning signs, not because they are careless, not because they lack intelligence, but because life can feel stable for so long that change becomes difficult to imagine, until the day it finally arrives, quietly, unexpectedly, and everything suddenly looks different. The danger was never the company. The danger was believing the future would always look exactly like the past. If this story made you reflect on your own career, consider subscribing. This channel explores real stories about work, life, and the quiet changes many people face after 40. And if you want to see another story like this, there's a video on your screen now about the moment many people realize their career has already started disappearing. You might notice something in that story that most people only understand far too late: fade out.